Welcome to the Filmmaker's Playbook. My name is Jason Branagan and this is a podcast all about filmmaking. On today's show, I talk to writer, script editor and development executive Nadine Flynn. Nadine currently works in development with Galway-based Danú Media, where she heads up their slate. Other work includes script editing on TV series like EastEnders and Fair City, as well as writing her own scripts. On today's show, we discuss how Nadine got started in television, what she learned working in the script department on Fair City and EastEnders, what a development executive actually does, how she works with writers, and what she loves about her job. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Thank you for listening. Nadine Flynn, thank you so much for joining me. It is so brilliant to see you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Great. So you are the development executive with Danú Media. Can you start by telling us all a little bit about what development entails?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this because it's such a tricky one because like my job looks different like every day. I guess to summarize it in like a sentence, I'm responsible for managing our slate of projects. So that can be, as soon as they come on board, right up before production. So things at all stages of development. So like what that includes is the process from getting an idea from a writer or a first draft script and taking that to the place where it's ready to move into pre-production and to finance and to package. So I guess that process can be very different depending on what you're working with. Like for example, we have recently optioned a novel, which, it has a story already locked in. We love the story. That's why we optioned it. So that development process is going to be a lot shorter than a new idea by a new writer, which could involve bringing in script editors and bringing in directors early to help us work through like sticky story problems and things like that. Whereas when you option maybe a novel and you love the story and it's very clear, visually, and you know exactly how it's going to work, that process could be a couple of months. So it's kind of my job to oversee those processes, make sure that the writers are getting the support they need, whether it's from us or an external script editor, working in almost like a story producer capacity as well sometimes, just trying to figure out how do you make this series work as like 6 episodes or 8 episodes, what's the best way to serve a narrative. So it's a lot of that. That's like the bulk of what I do and what the process is like. A lot of it as well is like finding the projects, which is a fun part too, and reading lots and lots of scripts.
You said a bunch of things there that we're going to come back to, but before we dig into some of the intricacies of what you have to do on a day-to-day basis, I would love to get a sense of how you got to where you are now and what your start was in this industry.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of got here by accident in a way. It like when I was in college, I didn't know anything about TV or film, and I didn't even think about it as an option. So I studied English in UCD. That was my BA because I really liked English in school, and that was kind of the only thing that drove me to do that. And during that course, I got into theatre, so I was involved in DramSoc and I took some theatre electives and I really loved that. And then I started to write a bit. And then I kind of thought, maybe theatre is the obvious way to go. So I did a master's in playwriting at the Lear. And yeah, I guess I didn't really know for sure what I wanted to do, but I liked writing, I liked being creative. And I started working with like the new theatre, and I did some reading for the Abbey, and I kind of took on a more dramaturgical role. So like supporting other writers, helping them develop their stories. And I think there was a point when I felt like that was serving me better than writing theatre myself, because it's so emotionally exhausting to write yourself and to put yourself into everything that you do. And then obviously it's really disappointing when you like don't get funding or, when you don't make money from it. And that's kind of the reality of theatre. But when you get to help someone, you get that satisfaction and it kind of fills your creative cup without giving too much of yourself. So I did that for a while. I also did some like admin jobs to kind of support that. I was working in Ticketmaster, every box office in Dublin City at some point, I'm pretty sure I worked in. And then I met a writer for Fair City, and I was like, I write, I could probably write for Fair City. And he introduced me to the executive producer, who was like, you could do a trial script, but realistically, you've never written for TV before, so it could be quite challenging. Or we're hiring an assistant script editor. So I was like, yeah, let's do that. Had no idea what the job was. never heard of a script editor before, so I was like Googling frantically to figure out what I'd have to do. But it pretty much was like what I was already doing. So it's supporting writers, it's dramaturgical work for the screen essentially. So I did that in Fair City for about 2 years. And I quickly realized that I loved it and that's all I wanted to do. And very quickly I was like, I just want to be a script editor. You know, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to find where the jobs are. There doesn't seem to be a lot in Ireland, but we'll make it work. So I did that for a couple of years. I was assistant there and then I edited some episodes. And then I moved on to EastEnders as a script editor, which was like one of the best things I've ever done. It was just so much fun. And I did that for about 3 years, maybe 2. It was during COVID, so the time kind of blurs. But I was also doing a lot of freelance work with Screen Ireland at the time as a script editor because I thought it was really important to, I suppose, keep one toe in like the pond in Ireland and the talent pool and keep up to date what people are doing. So that really helped my CV, like doing that development work and staying, you know, creating contacts here. And so after a few years, a lot of companies in Ireland got that Creative Futures funding from Screen Ireland, and a lot of companies were hiring development people, which was quite new because there wasn't a lot of development people here at the time. And I got the job with Danú. So, you know, the trajectory wasn't super linear, but I'm really happy with how it went. And if you asked me 10 years ago what would I want to do, I would have never said this because I had no idea it existed. But here we are.
I love that you just touched on the fact that it hasn't been a linear journey, because it very rarely is in this game. And sometimes I think people can potentially not see the true value in particular roles as a means of moving on to the next thing as well. I was going to ask, and you answered this already, that dramaturgy is, in a sense, script editing, just different worlds. If we go back a little bit just to moving into television and moving into Fair City and writing for or working on the screen, what was that transition like from theatre to TV? Was there a big learning curve there for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it is, there's obviously fundamentals with writing that apply to both theatre and TV. But I think the biggest change was like the people you're working with. You know, when you're working in theatre, you're kind of working one-on-one with just a writer, maybe the director. You know, they probably haven't even cast it yet. But when you're working on a show like Fair City, which has been around like, you know, as long as I have, probably longer, there's cast members there who've been playing that role. And then I'm coming in and I'm like, you know, pretty fresh. And I'm saying, oh, you can't say this line. And they're like, what do you mean? So it's definitely tricky trying to manage that. And I wouldn't say like it's even managing egos. You're just managing people who like know more than you. So it's a tricky position to be in, I think, at times. And it's crazy to see just how fast things move as well, you know, because you're working on a show that has a budget and it has a system and they're pumping out like 200 and some episodes a year. And so you have to work like at an insane pace, whereas with theatre, you can kind of take your time. So that was another massive adjustment, is like pace. And I'm so glad that I did it. Like, you know, I know a lot of people who don't start out in soap. They start out in, you know, like high-end dramas with indies. But I think when you're starting out in soap, you're totally thrown into the deep end. You know, those 5 episodes are going to be filmed whether, you know, there's no like, you can't delay. You've deadlines every single day. And actors will call in sick, like, you know yourself, like things will happen that you can't control. And so you have to like think smart and work fast. And there are things that, yeah, I didn't have to do as much in theatre.
I can relate to the idea of when you go into that world, you are kind of a blow-in and
Yeah.
everyone else knows more than you. And it's a very fine balance in terms of how you build trust with all of those people around you. What were the biggest lessons or takeaways that you took from your time on Fair City?
I think one of the biggest things is like understanding how budgets work, which might seem obvious, but you know, I went into that job having no idea like how much things would cost, for example. I still don't totally know that. But when you're working with a writer, you're figuring out how to not just write a story that's like dramatic and engaging and like serves these characters, but also a story that like you can tell with the money you have, the sets you have, you know, and like the minutes you have on screen as well. you're trying to keep track of page count and making sure things don't go over. So I think what I took from that is like understanding the whole production model. And of course that changes. No two production models are the same, not even in soap. EastEnders is, again, completely different. But it really helped me then going into EastEnders. So I'm like, I can't say to a writer, why don't you have this guy like crash his car? Because that's like a director's nightmare. As you know, you want to make shows that are like realistic and achievable. And now working development, I'm not working in soap anymore, but those things are still relevant. When I'm working with new writers, it's like, how could we make this script achievable? And like budgets have, the cost of everything has gone up so much nowadays that it's super important that we can make those stories work without some, explosives and things like that. So I think that's a big thing I took is looking at the whole picture and not just having my head stuck in story.
So that is then a conversation that maybe you are having with writers you're working with now as well, in terms of needing to be conscious of what can actually be achieved. It's not a case of just go write what you want and then come back and we'll look at it. You're potentially trying to think in bigger picture terms early on.
Yeah, I try to. I think when I'm working with a writer, I'm always imagining the things that my bosses will be like, we can't do this. And I'm trying to filter as much, I suppose. But, in saying that, I would never completely prioritize like money over like narrative. If you're working on a script, like for example, that's like a sci-fi story, you want to be able to serve the writer and serve the story. And so you're not going to be trying to do it as cheap as possible. Like, I'm not saying that that's the right way to do it, but sometimes you might read a script that has an explosive, for example, in the middle of it, and you're like, there's so many other ways we could achieve this. And again, like if you're putting in these things in a script, and that's going to take money away potentially from casting, and cast is super important. So I do try and keep those things in my head, but I also try and give the writer as much as they want from it too. So it's kind of balancing those. It's balancing like the voice of the writer who is really ambitious and the voice of the producers who are in charge of the budgets, and you're kind of the middle person and you're trying to make everyone happy.
Okay. It sounds quite holistic though, because at the end of the day, there's no point in having a script that's brilliant and going to cost 300 million to make and you're never going to get to make it.
Yeah, and like writers will send us scripts like that. And we just can't, like we can't do that, like, because it's just, they're going to be so hard to make. And it's kind of like why period dramas, people are saying they don't want to make period dramas unless you're like, you've made Peaky Blinders. But sometimes we'll get a script and we'll be like, look, this isn't really achievable. But, at the same time, it's great to see what a writer is capable of, and that might start a relationship with a writer. So it's not like we're not making this, that's that done. It's like, we can't make this, but let's keep talking. So I do think it's good for writers to keep things like that in mind too. It's, know what's possible in this day and age. I think since COVID and things have just, like prices have shot up. And again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a producer, but I try to keep things grounded when I can.
That makes sense. Post Fair City then, you went over to EastEnders. How different was EastEnders to Fair City?
Yeah, it was pretty different, even in like the language they use. So, like for example, I don't know what they call their first drafts in Fair City anymore, but when I was there, it was like D1s. In EastEnders, they're like yellow drafts. So even the language you can get caught up on. That was like the first obstacle to overcome. I think as well, it's just the scale. That's the biggest difference. Like, they have so many people in EastEnders. Everyone is, there's like so many jobs that don't exist in Fair City that exist in EastEnders. And again, that just comes down to scale and budget and output and what the needs are for the show. So that was a big thing. It's like understanding that, oh, I need to talk to this person who's in charge of this thing that I didn't even know existed. And the script editor role in EastEnders, you literally are the center of it all. You have to talk to costume, you have to talk to research, you have to talk to production. Like if you have one character hand another character a piece of paper, design will ask you what has to be written on that piece of paper. So it's more broad, which can make it a lot harder. But I think it's kind of more rewarding then when you are across so many aspects of it, that you're not across in Fair City. Like in EastEnders, script editors watch the exec cuts with the executive producer and the director, and they get to give their feedback, which is you know, it's fun to do that and to feel like you have a voice that's heard in those moments. Again, it's just down to scale, and like there's 6 editors in there, I think. I don't know how many there is now. There's 2 editors and 2 assistants in Fair City, so it's a whole different beast.
From the perspective of story, what did working on EastEnders teach you?
I guess with EastEnders, I would have been a bit more involved in like story planning than so in both EastEnders and Fair City have a story team, but they're a little bit more integrated in EastEnders. So you could pitch stories, and probably will be like picked up. You know, I pitched like some bad stories, I'm sure, but you're kind of encouraged to do that. So it gets you thinking about like long-term story arcs, and how can you create a story that's not only like dramatically engaging for like 1 week, but like 2 years, and like how can that story affect other characters. You know, you want to make it have like you know, like Phil will cheat on Sharon, and 2 years later that story is still playing and there's so many other characters involved now. So it's how do you create stories with momentum, that will give you that snowball effect where they'll just get bigger and bigger. But also it's like, how do you, again, it comes down to like structuring episodes. And you know, I learned so much from Fair City doing that. But EastEnders doesn't have ad breaks like Fair City does on BBC, which again it's such a small thing, but it does affect how an episode plays out and those dramatic beats. So yeah, it's just structural things as well. It gets you really sharp on. And then it's kind of tricky because you're working on like a 1 hour drama, and you have to kind of forget some of that because not everything, like soap has its own structure. And those rules can't apply to everything. So I think that's the biggest thing I took from that.
There's a couple of things there you said that I'd love to dig into. The idea of momentum, like dramatic momentum, something that carries. I don't know what my question is, but I think it's a great concept. In John Yorke's Into the Woods, there's a little piece in it where he talks about a writer on EastEnders, and this writer said, I'm paraphrasing now, I'm going to probably butcher it, but they didn't understand how to write a scene until they realized that at the end of every scene should be a doof doof, not just the cliff, not just the hooks. I remember reading that and it just resonated with me in a big way. And I'm like, that's a great piece of advice. Every scene should end that way.
Yeah, definitely. And like even the phrase the duff duff moment, I use that all the time outside of EastEnders. Like I was, you know, like I was teaching some classes in IDT and we were talking about like the duff duff moment and how do you find that in your story? So it's not even like EastEnders has like, let me borrow this phrase now that I love to use. And I think it's such a good example. It's like, because everyone, even if you don't watch EastEnders, I feel like everyone knows the sounds of the duff duff. Like everyone has heard it and they know what it means. It's like someone standing over a body with a hammer and you get your duff duff. And it's like, how do you find those moments in your work? You know, I think everyone should watch the clip scene of an episode of EastEnders if they haven't.
100%, totally agree. One of the other things I was going to say about EastEnders, you mentioned the idea of, as a script editor, being able to kind of pitch in on story in a different way than maybe a show like Fair City facilitates. And I remember doing my reading day for the first time and having these scripts which I had read, and they were so flexible in terms of going, this isn't really working for us. There's not enough drama, so let's just get rid of it and we'll just do something else. And it was a really interesting experience because I hadn't had that experience prior to that show. Again, because of the scale and the budget and the nature of it, that it has that level of adaptability to just go, no, we can do better, so let's do better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone in there, from my experience, is like super open-minded and always wants to tell the best story. And you might plan a story and 3 months down the line you realize, you know, another story is kind of impacting that, or it's not working like you'd hoped, or the characters have developed a bit differently than you thought they would if it's a new character. So it's really great to be in an environment where people are like always willing to take it on the run and always willing to change and always willing to be better because it challenges you, you know, and it's really hard. And obviously restorying things is never ideal from a production and financial standpoint, but like I think Yeah, maybe I'm biased, but I think EastEnders is really good at their long-term stories. Like even now, they had a big whodunit at Christmas, which links back to a story that like kind of had a big moment like 3 Christmases ago, or maybe even longer when Phil found out that Sharon cheated on him with Keanu. Um, so yeah, and I think again like they work because people are adaptable and they're aware of the audiences and what they want, and all those elements show on screen, I think.
Did working in that kind of environment shape the way you potentially work now when you're working in development, in terms of, do you try to push and pull ideas in lots of different directions to see what will work and what won't work, instead of maybe having blinkers on and going, this is the idea or this is the story?
Mhm.
And does that maybe come from a place of working in an environment where you could be so adaptable with story?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big difference with that is like, working on a soap, you're working for these characters, or you're working on characters that have been established and they don't really belong to anyone. They're kind of like the nation's characters in a way. And then you work with a writer on an original idea, and that's their characters and that's their story. So I guess you can't, in some ways, be as flexible because you need to stay true to like that writer's vision. Whereas with EastEnders, a writer could be writing for the show for a year, but that show's been on for 34 years. And, you know, there's more flexibility there. Again, some writers are super flexible, and I love to have like back and forth with writers. I love to, when I give notes, to give suggestions. Whether or not a writer takes it is totally up to them. But sometimes if they don't take it, it might point out a flaw or spark something else. And I love that back and forth. I really enjoy it, and I think the biggest way that type of work in EastEnders has impacted me now is my attitude. So I feel like I never really panic anymore. Like, fingers crossed I haven't jinxed myself, but when you're working to like extremely tight deadlines and you're rewriting a story 2 days before the shoot, you kind of develop this like, we'll get it done attitude. Because, and you always do, like, because the soaps, they have to come out, like, there's no delaying an episode. So now when I work, I kind of have that attitude of like, it's always going to be okay as long as we work our hardest. Like it's never gonna fall to pieces as long as everyone's trying their best. And so yeah, I don't get stressed working with writers like I maybe would have when I first started, and I kind of panicked a bit and I wanted things to be the best they can be, and I still want that, but not in a way that makes me like pull my hair out. And I hope that writers appreciate that, and they also don't feel stressed, because it is a tricky relationship working with writers. Sometimes you click and sometimes you don't, and you have to figure that out. And I think working with EastEnders has given me that kind of, it had made me a little bit more laid back in that area, and it's something that I really enjoy. And yeah, I think that's helped the relationships, and a good relationship is ultimately going to lead to a better story.
Couldn't agree more. And I think in a certain sense, soap is a brilliant training ground, and it absolutely is a storm in lots of ways, and you are kind of just thrust into it. And as well, from Fair City, and when we were both on that show together, days where things happen and all of a sudden you're on the lot and scenes are being written
Yeah, on the fly.
and you're waiting on them to come down so you can shoot. And it's totally out of anyone's control. It's not for any lack of planning. It's just life. So I think it's a great training ground for testing your durability in certain situations.
Absolutely. And I actually think that's the fun of it too, isn't it? Like running frantically down the stairs with like a pencil and a script is fun. Like I felt like in those moments, obviously they were like incredibly stressful, but afterwards you have this sense of accomplishment that, working in development now, I don't work in production anymore. I work in development, and EastEnders is very much production editing. So you don't kind of get that thrill of like running downstairs frantically with papers in my hand. I do miss it sometimes.
It's great.
Yeah, it's great when nothing is working, but it's character building.
Absolutely. So if we go back to the development then, earlier on, you kind of gave us that overview of what you do as a development exec, but maybe we might try and pull that apart a little bit and get into the nitty gritty. So you had mentioned one of the aspects being finding scripts and finding stories that you enjoy and that you're willing to spend an awful lot of time with and on. So how do you go about that aspect of your job?
So I have a lot of relationships with a lot of different agents, which have came from me just reaching out to them, being like, "Are you representing any exciting writers?" And they would send my writers my way, and so I'd be reading a lot of scripts, and then I'd have meetings with these writers. So a lot of it is me reaching out and looking for the talent. It's attending film festivals, it's attending markets, it's going to theatre, it's reading novels. But then I also have like an open door policy, and I'm always happy to talk to a writer if they get in touch, whether they're represented or not. So a lot of that as well can come from writers reaching out to me. I find like the most productive times, or when I am the busiest, is like during like the Galway Film Festival and the festivals here, when they have these networked events. I think they're great. So yeah, a lot of the relationships kind of come from actively searching,
Okay, interesting.
I like to have a list of scripts to read. 9 out of those 10 scripts probably won't get commissioned and again, it's not because it's just, sometimes you need to build that relationship first. So if a script isn't for us, it usually starts a conversation and it starts a relationship. And whenever I read a great script by a writer but it's not for us, I always say to them, like, get me across your work. And yeah, I think it's really exciting to be part of a writer's journey and read their work in a year's time and see how they've come on. It's kind of more about finding the voice rather than the script,
Do you have a process for reading those scripts? And by that, I mean, if you have a stack of 20 scripts to read and they're 90 to 100 pages each, if they're features, that just takes a lot of time, which is why or where the idea of make the first 10 pages really good or make those pages count comes from. But do you have kind of any protocols where you say, look, I'll read the first 10 pages and if I'm in, I'll go a little bit further? Or how do you kind of manage that process?
Yeah, it is a bit, your heart does drop a little bit when someone sends you like 150-page script without a synopsis. So I usually ask for a synopsis if it's a feature. Even it doesn't have to, sometimes it can be a treatment, sometimes it can be one page. And that's kind of like my first instance, is like, does this story sound interesting? Even if it doesn't sound interesting, I'll still probably start reading the script, because sometimes people are, great writers and maybe not the best at like executing premises and stuff. So I always ask for that. And yeah, I think I give it like 20 pages. And if the synopsis wasn't super catchy and if the 20 pages aren't really working, then I kind of know. And sometimes from a synopsis, like, there's some things we don't do as a company, like we're kind of trying to do less period drama, and again that comes back to like costs, and it's very difficult to sell at the moment. So if somebody emails with a pitch for that, sometimes I can say I don't think it's for us straight away. But yeah, I do read a lot of scripts. I usually finish them. We get a lot of good scripts. I haven't had one that has been like painful in a while, so but yeah, I would stop at 20 if it was.
And then are there any identifiers for you of good writing? And this is a really broad question, but it is such a subjective industry, and there could be a really well written script that works really well dramatically, but you're like, I don't like this type of film. If it is maybe something that the company still does. So I was curious about how then do you remove yourself maybe, or your bias from that, or is that bias ultimately a positive in reading and trusting your gut and your instinct?
Yeah, it's tricky. Like, obviously objectivity is super important. I suppose, like, I know what my boss's tastes are, and so sometimes I'll have that in mind, maybe more so than my own, because there's some things we probably don't have the same type of taste on. But I do think it's important to keep that in mind, because usually our process is I'll read a script first. If it's interesting, I'll pass it on to the team. And so I'm kind of like, is this something they'll want to read? Is this something they'll want to make? And sometimes you have to think about those things. And if it's a case that, subjectively, it's not the type of story we want to do, but we like the writing, then we will like for sure keep a relationship going there. And I think like a period drama, for example, I said we don't do a lot of. I also find them, sometimes like hard to read because I don't necessarily enjoy period dramas. So when I am reading them, I'm trying my best to like appreciate the writing, and find the good in them and take those biases away. For me, what always makes scripts stand out is like, people talk a lot about like dialogue and character, but sometimes if someone writes like action really clearly and really well, that's a really big thing for me. Sometimes there will be scripts with very little dialogue and a lot of action happening. And it's like, you need to make that engaging too. It's not just the dialogue. It's like, you need to think about the person reading the script. And yeah, I always feel like that can sometimes sell a script to me. I'm like, oh, that writer they can write, not just dialogue, but they can write a story and they can write something that's hooky and engaging. And yeah, I mean, I have read period dramas recently and I've read them all because they're really good, but we're not going to do it. But I've stayed in touch with those writers. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing that like we absolutely won't read. Like, even though we don't do period, if it sounds remotely interesting in the synopsis, I will read it. But yeah, so I think for writers, like I would say, don't worry too much about the genre, but like focus on your actual writing, how you execute that.
And when you talk about action being written really well, do you mean it's written in a very visual way so that you are seeing the film or you're seeing the pictures of it as you read, or something else?
Yeah, like visually for sure, but also tonally, I suppose. Like, especially with comedy. So if you're reading a comedy script, um, you kind of want the action to be written in a comedic way too. And again, like, this isn't necessary. This is just kind of like my taste. This is what I enjoy. This is what like gets me excited. But if someone's action slash like stage directions can also make you laugh as well as the story and the characters, then I think that's shown me that they do know humor and comedic timing. And as well, it's the same with like reading a synopsis. It's very hard to write a synopsis. I struggle writing synopsis and I have to do it sometimes for like applications and things like that. So like, I appreciate it's probably harder to write the synopsis than it is the script at times. But if someone can like give you a sense in just their like prose of the tone, if it's, then that shows me that they know what they're trying to make and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And it's a really good point. So I'm glad I asked that question. How do you handle then giving notes to the writers you're working with?
I've been very lucky that like all the writers I've worked with since starting with Danú have been super open and excited to get notes. There's a lot of writers who haven't worked with script editors and so they're really excited by the process. There's obviously a lot of writers out there who probably don't like to get notes. But my approach is always to like let the writer lead. So before I'll even start notes, I'll usually have a call with the writer, try and keep it as casual as I can, just like familiarize ourselves with each other, figure out exactly what it is they're trying to say, what's really important for them, what they would be open to. Like, sometimes it's even good to say to a writer, are you open to me giving suggestions, or like, do you just want me to point out the flaw, what's not working? And most writers are usually open to suggestions. So it's kind of like feeling each other out in a way. It's kind of like a speed dating sometimes. It's like trying to get as much information as you can. And yeah, and then my approach is like keeping the writer's concerns or ambitions in mind when doing the notes. And always, emphasizing that these are a guideline. My suggestions, you don't have to do. And then I always have a follow-up call as soon as I can afterwards to just chat through it with the writers, because I guess some writers will get a load of notes and they'll panic because they haven't before, but it's not always a sign that like something isn't good. It's like sometimes the more notes I give, the more excited I am by something, because I'm like, oh, there's so much to unpick here. There's so much fun to be had. So yeah, I do try and like let the writer lead and make sure that they know that it's up to them and they have that control, because the last thing you want to do is make a writer feel like you're trying to change their story.
Are there any recurring notes that you find in work that you are working on, do you find yourself always going back to structure or always going back to character? Or again, it's a broad question, very difficult to answer. Every script and every writer is going to be different, but just out of curiosity.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, like, I think you covered it. Like, I do find that I always go back to character. I do think character is a really tricky thing to nail down, especially in the early drafts. But I often find that writers will have this like great story and these really interesting characters, but their arcs aren't always super clear. And like I know that with like Screen Ireland, for example, they're really big on character, and a character is essentially what like sells a piece. A story's only ever as good as your characters. So I'm always trying to encourage writers to like go back to character and like prioritize that, and not even like the development of who the character is, but their journey over the narrative. And then yeah, like structure, sometimes there's always that kind of struggle I see between like character and plot. So and there's like TV shows out there that are incredibly plot driven, and work. Sometimes they work, but sometimes people will let a good story be ruined by plot. That can happen, and sometimes there will be no plot. So I do think like plot and character are the two things that we're always trying to like hammer down, especially when it comes to a TV series rather than a film, because you're trying to like, how do you maintain a dramatic plot over like 6 or 8 episodes, and sometimes a writer will have a great idea and they'll have a great pilot, and then you're like, okay, so what happens in episode 4? And they're like, oh. So it's trying to find that dramatic vein and make sure that's run throughout a series. So yeah, they're kind of the two big things. They're the big notes that everyone gets.
What you were describing there in terms of TV makes me think of that word momentum that you used there. Something to just like a good story engine.
Absolutely, yeah.
When you were talking about character, 2 things that popped into my head was, one was the idea that character is structure, and the second was, it's a quote. I don't know who it's from, but I can think of it from a song by a rock band called A Day to Remember, and its character is who we are, or who you are when no one is watching. What I was thinking about asking was this sense of like, what do you think of character as in dramatic terms?
I think my answer is probably a bit basic and institutionalized from working for so long, but I always think of their wants and their needs, and like I said, it's probably a bit basic, but because that's the thing that's going to drive the story, isn't it? It's like, do they get what they want? Do they get what they need? Do they get neither? What are they chasing? What are their ambitions? So it's less about, for me, like, what type of person are they? Are they funny? Are they awful? Because, they don't have to be likable. A lot of people say that they have to be. I don't think they do. There's some awful characters out there who I love to watch. But it's like, what's their goal? What are they chasing? What's the thing that like lights the fire in them? I suppose that's kind of the questions that I have when talking to writers about characters. What's under the surface? Like if you take Succession, for example, they're all awful people. None of them have really likable qualities, but they're all incredibly unique with their own like, I suppose, burning desires, and that's why we watch it. It's like, are they going to get it? So when I talk about character, I kind of look at it like that. Maybe that's more character arc, but that's kind of what I think about. I love like weird, contradictory characters. Like, I love seeing hypocrites. It's like, how do you make your characters complex and endearing in those complexities?
It's kind of that sense of the appearance or the facade that they wear day to day versus the reality and the flaw that actually is the thing that's inside of them.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, it's getting under the surface, I'll often read like a Bible with a character breakdown. Their characters sound really cool, but then when you read the script, you're like, oh, I don't get that thing that you're saying that they do, or like, I'm not getting that sense of that part of them, because sometimes people don't like dig deep enough, I think. And like, there's lots of great characters out there. Whenever I'm working with writers, people have great ideas. It's very hard to dig deep. Like, I get it, but yeah, it's like, what's the worst thing you can do to your character? And they, like, what, like, how do you push the limits with them? That's always, I think, results in really interesting protagonists.
Are there any particular ways you think writers can dig into that? Is it a case of going, okay, well, I need to isolate this character's like worst fear and use something like that? Or how do you dig deep?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Like sometimes I feel like if I'm working with a writer and the character isn't really working, I'll suggest, maybe you need to just go and you just need to write a page of like backstory or like, talk about what they like. And it's funny because like they do that in soap. So like they'll have lots of information on their characters. They'll have what their character's favorite drink is. They'll have what annoys them. And so when a new writer is coming on board and they're writing a character, you can send them that, so they're not like ordering a drink at the bar that they wouldn't. And again, this is so small. But I think it's good for the writer to know completely who their character is. What can they not stand? What their morals are. Do they lie? And sometimes as an editor, like you can help a character's journey, you can help find the drama in the character, but you can't write that context. That's something that writers kind of sometimes have to do in isolation, which is again very tricky. And I'm always like really happy to talk about characters and talk about how could you make them more interesting, how could you make them more engaged, and how do you make them contradict themselves. But it is one of those things where a writer needs to sit back and spend a bit of time with their character, as cliche as that sounds.
I think it's good advice, though. Alexander McKendrick has a book called On Filmmaking, and a large portion of it is about writing and dramatic structure. And one of the actionable items of that book when it comes to character is this idea of writing monologues for your characters, but writing that monologue as if it is them in the first person talking about the events of the film. So creating this monologue from beginning to end and looking at the film or the TV series or whatever it may be from their perspective. And it's something I have tried and found quite useful in terms of trying to flesh out characters and to actually understand them a little bit more. And that idea that you mentioned of figuring out what their morals are and their unique points of view within the worlds that they're existing in.
Yeah, for sure. And I think sometimes people can put all their energy into their protagonist and potentially lose sight of some other characters. And I noticed that that's a note I give a lot. It's you don't want other characters there that are just there to serve your main character. Like they should all have an important part in the story. They should also help fuel the narrative. And I think if you are a writer and you feel like you're struggling with character, as well as reading books, like just watch some like TV shows, like watch Breaking Bad, like watch Succession, watch Mayor of Easttown. Like look at these interesting, complex characters and figure out why you like them. And then, try and take that and implement that into your own work. I think Walter White and Jesse Pinkman are both amazing characters. And it's how they're contradictory. It's their conflict that makes them so interesting. So yeah, I think just watch as much good TV and film as you can.
We may have touched on this as well as we've talked, but what are some of the common mistakes maybe that emerging and new writers are making when they are then approaching you with scripts or with synopses or stories?
This is it might seem like such a small thing, but sometimes like formatting can get me. Like, if a writer sends you script and I also appreciate that like final draft is expensive, but there are lots of free softwares out there. And sometimes if I get a script that's like written in Word and it's a bit messy, that can kind of make me immediately be a bit like, oh, is this writer, like, are they, I don't know, like, are they serious about this? And I think that's just something maybe to keep in mind. I also like spelling is something that can get me too. It's like just proofreading scripts, and like sometimes I'll read scripts and characters, they'll get names mixed up and I can kind of figure it out, but I'm just like, just proofread it and we'll be good. But yeah, I think as well, like I'm not sure what draft writers always send me, whether it's their first draft and whether it's their fourth draft. I think a lot of writers will send their first draft maybe because they finally written this thing and they want to get it out there. And they probably want to go into development obviously with a company, and that whole thing of going into development is tricky. It's like, do you go in with a script? Do you not go in with a script? What stage do you go in at? But I do think a writer should be like 100% ready to move forward when they're sending out a script, and it should be the best version. They should almost feel like it's totally solid, you know, and like chances are you are going to have to develop it, you are going to work with producers and things are going to come up, but it's making sure the version they're sending is the absolutely strongest version, because I have read scripts before that I really liked, but they felt like they were like a couple of drafts away from us optioning them, you know, and again, it's like tricky. It's like, well, isn't your job to develop scripts? Like, yeah, but you do have to have something solid coming in, whether that's an idea or whether it's the script itself. So sometimes they're not quite ready to be in the hands of a producer. So I think it's thinking about that, you know.
Okay. You mentioned there the idea of what stage you are at as well, in terms of not necessarily even the script, but the material you have. So I was going to ask if you have, personally or from a company perspective, a strong opinion on that, because I have been on two sides of it personally, where one side I've done too much development and someone doesn't feel that they can come in and really shape it and make it more of their own. And the other side then being, no, do more development and then come back. We like it, but we just want to see where you would take it.
It's very, very tricky. And every company is different. So like the thing of things being overdeveloped, if someone sent me a script and they were like, this is my 5th draft and I know who I'm going to cast and I have a director attached and here's a pitch deck, then it's kind of hard. It's like, well, you know, what do you want? Are you just looking for a co-producer? Are you looking for someone to serve as producer? Do you want someone to come in, and are you open to us having input? Because we do feel like, you know, whatever we make, even if service producing, like you do kind of want to have a bit of input. You want to put your stamp on something. So that's something that could come up. The thing about things being too early, like it is really tricky. You know, we have optioned something based on like a synopsis, but that was based on a play. So we had read the play, it was like a one-man show, and we read the synopsis and we really liked it, and we optioned that. That's kind of the earliest we've done anything. We have optioned a novel without, you know, kind of based on the novel. That's a bit different. Usually we would like, I suppose, a treatment, like a developed treatment. Like we would like the writer to know where the story's going, even if they don't have the episode done. So if a writer comes and says, I have an idea for a series, here's an outline of what happens in the series, and here's a breakdown of every episode, then like, great. You know, I might say, do you have any script of anything so I can get a sense of your writing, just so I know what you're like as a writer. And then that works for us. You know, if a writer comes to us and says, here is a feature film, I've written the script, we might say, okay, we like it, but we think the script could do it a bit more work, so we'd be happy to come in development. So yeah, I'm like, there's no one way of doing it for us. We're quite open. I realize now I'm contradicting myself when I say that sometimes people send you things that don't feel ready, but that again comes down to kind of the quality of the script, you know. And sometimes things have potential, and sometimes things have that gem, and you know that like gem can exist without it being fully developed. So I feel like I can't say, like, it's really tricky. It's on a project to project basis, and again, of course, if it's with a writer who you've worked with before, you have a more of a relationship, you know what their work's like, you know what their output is like, then you can also come in earlier because you trust them, you know that they're like a great writer, you've done it before. If it's a new writer, sometimes things have to be a little bit more developed. I know someone who went to a company with an idea and they said, yeah, like, write the script and come back to us. And again, that like, yeah, like that's annoying because they probably want to get paid for writing the script, as they should. So it's very tricky. I think you don't have to have a script, but you have to have a solid idea. And you have to have thought that through at the outline stage.
It is definitely a tricky one, but understandably as well, if you have not written anything before, someone is going to want to see that you can write.
Exactly. So like even have a spec script, you know, I think it's super important to have a spec script. I think if you have like 10 ideas for TV shows, no one expects you to have 10 pilots, but you're expected to have one solid spec script. That's going to like sell you as a writer. And I think that's the main thing to think about.
And then again, as you said, If you've worked with someone before, it's a bit different. If you're Jed Mercurio, you can probably sell a show on 2 sentences.
On an elevator pitch, probably, yeah. It's very tricky and it's very hard as a writer, and every company is different. So, you could spend, one company could be like, write a script and then come back to me, and then you could write it and they could say no, and then another company could say, well, we don't want to come on board if you already have the script. It's very, very hard. So maybe sometimes it's best to like focus on your treatment, focus on your outline, your Bible if you're doing a series, and then see what feedback you get, and have a spec script at hand. It doesn't have to be for that series, and kind of test the waters that way before jumping fully in and writing a pilot, because that's going to take a lot of time.
Yes, it will. So the other thing that we haven't maybe touched on, but maybe worth mentioning briefly, is then how hyper competitive it is and how many scripts, if someone was to email you and say, here's my film, the time it takes when that goes into the pile for you to get to it versus how many other scripts are actually in circulation.
Yeah, it can take a long time, and I do feel very bad for writers who are waiting, because I know what it feels like to be on the other end of that. But, like, we're a small company, and we have every week we try and meet to discuss all the scripts, and sometimes we can get through them quick, and sometimes, we can have 10 scripts to get through. So it can take a couple of weeks. It's not the fastest. It's probably the slowest part of the process. Once you get optioned, things can move quite fast. But we do read everything, like we do consider everything. So I think if you've emailed me and I haven't got back to you yet, like, I will come back to you. Don't worry.
Do you have any advice for maybe emerging writers, or maybe a better way of phrasing it, which I ask people regularly, is what is one piece of advice you would give to young Nadine embarking on a career in the arts?
Oh God. I think if I was giving myself advice, it would have been like, start, try and get into the industry earlier. Like, how do I even say it? It's like I said, I went into theatre not really knowing what I wanted to do and not knowing these jobs exist. And I think if I could go back, I would like try and be more informed. I try and engage with the industry a bit sooner. And again, I think a lot of that again comes down to like what's accessible out there. I think there's way more courses now, and there's the National Talent Academies, and there's a lot more resources than for maybe when I was in school. But I would have loved to not have kind of like wasted time in box offices. I love the work I did in theatre, but there's so much out there. There's so many things being made, and maybe I would have liked to be a runner for a while, which I know is a very hard job, but maybe, I kind of skipped that part. When I was in EastEnders, there was people who were runners and like, assistants, and they were doing all the kind of like hard graft on the floor, and I don't think I ever paid my dues in that area. So maybe I'd go back, I'd start a little bit sooner, and I'd try and get a 360 overview of the industry as early as I could. I think advice for writers is, again, like, work on a solid spec script. I know we talked about you want to work with a writer, or as a writer, you don't want to write things that don't feel like feasible, that to get made, and so you don't want to like frighten someone off. But I think if you have a spec script, you can absolutely throw absolutely everything on it. There can be like 10 explosions, because like that's your spec script, like that's your calling card. I think if you're writing a spec script, you should do whatever showcases you're writing to the best of your ability. So if you're a genre writer and you want to write horrors, then like don't worry about budgets. Like, write the scariest, best horror you could write. If you want to write for sci-fi, again, don't worry about budgets. Like, put it all down with the knowledge, knowing that that's your spec script, that's your calling card. That's what's going to get you general meetings. That's what's going to get development execs interested in your work. It's probably not going to be made, but that's what, when someone says to you, do you have a sample of your writing, you can confidently say, yeah, here you are. And I think, like I said, if you have a really strong spec script, then it doesn't matter if you don't have a pilot for the series you're pitching, because you have a pitch deck and you have a series, and if someone wants to read your writing, they can read your spec script, so I think that's great to do, to put a lot of time in. I think when you're writing scripts for multiple projects, it can be tricky, whereas if you could have one that you could put all your energy in. So if you're a new writer, I would definitely suggest spend a bit of time on that, finding your voice, and having a sample script that you can confidently send to anyone who wants to read a sample of your writing.
Would you recommend your job to people who want to enter the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I love my job and I feel very, very lucky to be doing what I do every day. I feel very lucky to work for, a great company who are super supportive and super open to like new ideas. I think if you love reading, then it's a good job because I read a lot. I get to meet people a lot. Even though I work remote, I get to I meet writers all the time. It feels like a very social job and it feels incredibly rewarding to, get to the end of development and look at a script that you've worked with, you spent a year on with a writer and be like, yeah, like we did this together. It's super rewarding and it isn't creatively or emotionally exhausting, like writing your own stuff is, which I know what that feels like too. But for me, it's all the good parts of it, I think. And work in development it's also a nice pace compared to production. So if you like things at a bit of a slower pace and you like having creative conversations and reading, then absolutely be a script editor or development exec.
Do you have any recommended reads or recommended resources that have impacted you positively, or that you would say to someone else, check this out?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to read too many books on script editing or like writing because, sometimes you can kind of get caught in a structure. I did do a workshop with John York a few years ago, like a weekend thing that I thought was amazing. Like you mentioned him earlier, he's a great idea of structure, and he has a book called Into the Woods. If you're a writer, that's a solid. I think the best thing to do though, whether you're a script editor, producer, writer, is to read scripts like of TV shows. So like the BBC have a script library. Philip Shelley has a script library on his website. You can find most like Oscar nominated scripts if you just Google it. Like reading pilots, if you want to write for TV, like read the pilot for Breaking Bad. If you want to like write for film, look at who's been nominated for Best Picture and read all those scripts. And I think that's just what's going to make you better is just reading scripts, watching TV and film, even the bad stuff sometimes, to figure out what not to do. But yeah, I think that would be my number one thing is read scripts.
On reading scripts, can I ask, might sound funny, but how do you read scripts? Because I think it could be really easy for people to go, okay, I'm going to read 10 scripts and read them and just power read and not actually really interrogate the script in terms of, well, why does it work?
Yeah, I know. I suppose it's different. If I'm reading like scripts on my reading list, I might read them a bit differently than reading a script that I'm editing, if that makes sense. Because I think when I read a script that someone sent me, I just read it, like as if I'm reading anything, and I usually know afterwards, about an hour after I've read it, whether or not it resonates with me and I'm still thinking about it, and if I remember it. And if my boss says to me the next day on a call, what happened in that script? What's that one about? And I can like sell that well, then I'm like, yeah, you know what, that was a good script. It lasted. When I'm reading scripts that I'm editing, I usually have to read them a couple of times because, the first one you like kind of fly through it. You're like, great, I've just read that and you're like, okay, now I need to go back and I need to think about character. Maybe I need to go back one more time, think about structure and make little notes. So that's definitely a more focused and procedural approach.
For writers looking to get better, if you go and you read the Breaking Bad pilot, obviously there's value in just reading it, but would you recommend also reading it and then going back and rereading it and seeing why it's working? Why does that structure work, or what beats are happening where and when?
Yeah, definitely it's worth reading with an eye on structure. I think Breaking Bad is like I always go back to that when talking about structure. I think as well, like, and they use the 5-act structure, which is what I think John York talks about in his book. Also reading like different types of scripts. So like maybe reading the pilot of Succession and reading the pilot of Breaking Bad back to back or on the same day and thinking, why do these both work when they're so different? Or like, what is the commonality of these scripts? Or does one break form? Does one go with it? Like what, like kind of compare them. And I think the more you read and the more you can compare, the more things will feel more obvious to you, the more you'll be able to see things more clearly, like you'll be able to see structure. So I think, and also like reading things within different genres and different tones, because a half-hour comedy is going to read way different to like an hour of Breaking Bad. And then that in its own, that has its own set of rules sometimes. So depending on the type of writer you are, what you want to do, it's good just to be across as many genres and, different tones of projects as you can. And think about, and look, maybe even it's a case of like sitting down and writing out what works and what doesn't for these scripts. I guess if you're reading all the really great scripts out there, it's going to be hard to find maybe what's not working. So think of a show you hate and read the script and see why.
Okay. Last question then is, what is coming up next for you, or are there any projects on the slate that you can talk about and let us know that we should be keeping our eyes and ears open for?
Yeah, so we're developing a number of projects. We have optioned Glorious Heresies by Melissa McInerney, which is a novel set in Cork. It's about all these families who are interconnected and how this one murder affects them all. But it's actually quite funny. It's quite light. It's very Cork. And that's something we're really excited about. So we're developing that at the moment with Lisa. It's in the early stages of development, but that's when I mentioned how we optioned a book, and it might be a lot quicker. I was thinking of that because her story, it's great, and it feels like it transposes to TV really well. So we're working on that, super exciting. We're working with Tony Doyle on a TV series based on his one-man play, Weekend Warrior. So that's kind of coming toward the end of development. So we're going to be taking that out soon and packaging that. So, and it's interesting because those projects are both so different, and Lisa and Tony's own experience is so different. So that's really exciting. And we're also going into production soon on a feature film. So everyone's a bit tied up with that. I'm trying to, hold the fort in the development side. That's probably why things are maybe a bit slower coming back to people. But we're super busy, and it's not a bad way to be. So it's very exciting.
Definitely. It's great to be busy, and it's great to hear that you're busy.
Yeah, and we're hoping, we're still always looking out for new projects. We're still always looking out for new writers. No matter how busy we are, we're never like, it's never like full stop. The slate is always open. We're always trying to find more. So, yeah.
Amazing. Well, Nadine, I just want to go back to one thing you said earlier, which was when you were talking about the advice you would give to your younger self, and it would be about entering the industry a little bit earlier, but you not knowing that these jobs existed or that you could go and do them. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your job, because a huge part of the podcast is to demystify this information. And I personally feel the exact same way. When I started in this industry, it was very much from the outside, and I didn't know what a huge amount of the jobs in the industry were for a really long period of time. So thank you for coming on and talking all about your own career, your current job as a development exec, and sharing your experiences.
No, thanks so much for having me. I could talk about development and soap all day long, but I wouldn't want to bore people too much. But yeah, no, it's great. And I think when I'm out there meeting people, I meet a lot of people who are really interested in becoming, a script editor or working in development. So, which I think is great. Like, the more the merrier. There's very few script editors here, so there definitely needs to be more. So I'm always happy to chat about those kinds of things.
Brilliant. I'll send Nadine's email out to everyone.
Yeah, I'll be kept busy.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's been fun.
And that's a wrap on Nadine Flynn. Thank you for listening to the Filmmaker's Playbook. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with a friend and follow and rate us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have feedback, questions, or topics that you'd like me to cover on the show, please put them in the comments section on our Instagram page at the Filmmaker's Playbook Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Jason Branagan Director, and you can find Nadine on Instagram at Flinstagram_. Links and social media handles are in the show notes. Join me next week when I talk to First Assistant Director Sarah Lucas. Until next time.